I never thought I would find myself in a legal battle with my own neighbors, but that's exactly what happened when Brenda Carmichael and her cronies on the HOA board decided I was their next target. It started on a Tuesday morning in Phoenix, Arizona, when I opened my mailbox to find a certified letter from the Sunnyside Estates Homeowners Association. My name is Quincy Norris, and I had been living peacefully in this suburban neighborhood for 3 years without any issues. I worked as a software engineer from home, kept my lawn pristine, and never caused problems. The letter informed me that the HOA was filing a lawsuit against me for unauthorized modifications to my property. My crime? Installing solar panels on my roof 6 months ago. I stood there in my driveway, reading the letter 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. The solar panels were completely legal under Arizona state law, which actually prohibited HOAs from banning them. I had even submitted the proper paperwork to the Architectural Review Committee and received written approval before installation. This made absolutely no sense. The letter went on to explain that because I had supposedly violated HOA rules, the board was pursuing legal action and had levied a special assessment of $2,000 on every homeowner in the community to cover their legal fees. Every single one of the 237 homes in Sunnyside Estates would be charged this amount to fund a lawsuit against me. My phone rang almost immediately. It was my neighbor from across the street, Marcus Chen. "Quincy, did you get that letter about the special assessment?" His voice was strained with anger. "Yeah, I just opened it. Marcus, I have no idea what this is about. My solar panels were approved. I have the paperwork." $2,000. They want $2,000 from each of us to sue you over solar panels. This is insane. My wife is furious. We were saving for our daughter's college fund. Over the next hour, my phone did not stop ringing. Neighbors I had barely spoken to were calling, some angry at me, others angry at the HOA. Everyone confused about why they were suddenly being charged such a massive amount. The special assessment letter had gone out to everyone simultaneously, and the neighborhood was in chaos. I decided to call an emergency meeting at my house that evening. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood Facebook group and email chains. By 6 o'clock, over 70 people had crowded into my living room, spilled out onto my porch, and filled my front yard. "Okay, everyone, please let me explain," I said, standing on my front steps so everyone could see me. 6 months ago, I installed solar panels on my roof. Before I did so, I submitted a formal application to the Architectural Review Committee. I have the approval right here. I held up the printed email from Gerald Hutchins, the HOA's Architectural Review Committee chairman at the time. The crowd murmured as I read the relevant section aloud, clearly stating that my solar panel installation was approved and complied with all community guidelines. A woman in her 30s named Rachel Montgomery pushed forward. "So why are they suing you? And why are they charging us for it?" "That's what I want to know," I said. "Arizona state law actually protects homeowners' rights to install solar panels. The HOA cannot legally prohibit them." An older man named Robert Jefferson spoke up from the back. "I served on the board 5 years ago. This smells like Brenda's doing. She's been power-hungry ever since she became president last year." The crowd erupted in agreement. Apparently, Brenda Carmichael's reign as HOA president had not been popular. Multiple people started sharing their own stories of petty fines and harassment. Someone had been fined for having their trash can visible from the street 15 minutes before the designated time. Another had been threatened with daily fines because their mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. "We need to see the HOA's financial records," said Patricia Owens, a retired accountant. "They can't just levy a special assessment without proper justification and documentation. We have a right to see where our money is going." I had not thought of that. "How do we request that?" Patricia pulled out her phone and started typing. "The HOA bylaws require them to provide financial records within 10 business days of a written request. I'm drafting an email right now. Everyone here should send one." The crowd agreed enthusiastically. Within minutes, dozens of people were sending formal requests to the HOA board email address, demanding to see the financial records and the legal justification for the special assessment. 2 days later, I received a response from Brenda herself. The email was curt and condescending, stating that the board had the authority to levy special assessments as they saw fit, and that the financial records would be made available at the next quarterly meeting, which was not scheduled for another month. "That's not legal," Patricia told me when I forwarded her the email. "They have 10 business days, not whenever they feel like it. We need to push back harder." Patricia organized a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversaw HOA regulations in the state. She also helped me draft a response to the HOA, citing the specific bylaw requiring timely financial disclosure. Meanwhile, I contacted a lawyer named David Friedman who specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in Scottsdale, about 30 minutes from my house. When I explained the situation, he actually laughed. "They're suing you over solar panels? In Arizona? That's the dumbest thing I've heard all month, and I deal with HOAs for a living. So I have a case? You don't need a case. They don't have a case. Arizona Revised Statute 33-1816 explicitly prohibits HOAs from restricting solar panel installation. Even if they wanted to sue you, they'd lose immediately. But the real issue here is this special assessment. If they're levying it without proper cause and without providing financial transparency, they're violating their fiduciary duty to the homeowners." David agreed to represent me, but he also suggested something else. "You should encourage your neighbors to attend the next board meeting in force. HOAs operate in the shadows because most homeowners don't pay attention. When you shine a light on them, they tend to back down quickly." The next board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. It was usually held in the small community center at the entrance to our neighborhood, a building that could hold maybe 40 people comfortably. Based on the fury I'd been seeing in the neighborhood Facebook group, I suspected we would need more space. I was right. On Thursday evening, over 150 homeowners showed up. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the hallways and crowding around the doors. Brenda Carmichael looked shocked when she walked in with the other board members: Vice President Linda Shaw, Treasurer Roger Patterson, Secretary Karen Sullivan, and at-large member Donald Hayes. Yes, one of them was actually named Karen, and she lived up to every stereotype. Karen Sullivan had been the one sending out most of the petty violation notices that had been plaguing the neighborhood. "This meeting is for board business only," Brenda announced, trying to take control of the room. "If you're not on the agenda, you'll need to leave." "We're not leaving," Marcus Chen called out from the front row. "You levied a special assessment against all of us. That makes it our business." The crowd roared in agreement. Brenda's face turned red, but she had no choice but to proceed with the meeting. She tried to rush through the standard agenda items, obviously hoping to avoid the elephant in the room, but Patricia Owens interrupted. "We're here to discuss the special assessment and to review the HOA's financial records, which you're legally required to provide and which you have not provided, despite multiple requests within the required time frame." Brenda shuffled papers nervously. "The board has determined that the special assessment is necessary to protect the community's interests." "Protect us from what?" Rachel Montgomery demanded. "From someone using solar panels that are completely legal and were already approved?" "The approval was granted in error," Karen Sullivan interjected, her voice shrill. "The solar panels are an eyesore and reduce property values." I stood up. "That's not true, and you have no evidence to support that claim. I have documentation showing that homes with solar panels in Arizona actually sell for more on average, but that's beside the point. State law protects my right to have them." Roger Patterson, the treasurer, looked uncomfortable. He was a quiet man in his 50s who had always seemed reasonable in the few interactions I'd had with him. "Brenda, maybe we should reconsider this course of action." "The decision has been made," Brenda snapped at him. "The board voted, and the majority agreed." "What was the vote?" someone called out. Brenda hesitated. "That's board business." "No, it's not," Patricia said firmly. "Board votes are required to be recorded in the minutes, which are public record for all homeowners. What was the vote?" After a long pause, Linda Shaw finally answered. 3-2, in favor of proceeding with legal action. The room erupted again. A 3-2 vote on something that would cost the community nearly $500,000 in special assessments, not to mention the legal fees that would mount if the case went forward. "Who voted for it?" Marcus demanded. "Brenda, Linda, and Karen," Roger said quietly. "Donald and I voted against it." This revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. Donald Hayes, who had been sitting silently, nodded in confirmation. Patricia stood up, holding a thick folder. I've done some research into our HOA's bylaws in Arizona state law. First, the special assessment as levied is illegal. Any special assessment over $1,000 requires a vote of the full membership, not just the board. Second, the board has violated multiple provisions of the bylaws by failing to provide financial records within the required time frame. Third, and most importantly, I filed a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate 3 days ago, and they've opened an investigation into the board's conduct. The 3 board members who had voted for the lawsuit looked panicked. Brenda tried to regain control. You had no right to do that. This is an internal community matter. Actually, I had every right, Patricia replied calmly, and so does every other homeowner here. But there's more. I also requested copies of all financial records from the management company the HOA uses. They're required to provide them, and they did. She opened her folder and pulled out a stack of documents. These records show some very interesting things. In the past year, the HOA has paid over $80,000 to Carmichael Consulting Services. Brenda, isn't that your company? The room went dead silent. Brenda's face turned from red to white. Those were legitimate consulting fees for community management services. What services? Patricia asked. We already pay a management company to handle community management. What exactly did Carmichael Consulting Services do that justified $80,000? Brenda did not answer. Karen Sullivan tried to defend her. The board approved those payments. The same 3 people who voted to sue Quincy, the same 3 people who are now trying to charge everyone $2,000. Rachel's voice was sharp. This is fraud. People in the crowd started pulling out their phones, some calling spouses who could not attend, others presumably researching Arizona laws about HOA fraud. Roger Patterson stood up, his face grave. I didn't know about the payments to Brenda's company. They were never disclosed to me or Donald. Brenda handled the finances directly with the management company. That's a violation of the bylaws, Patricia said. The treasurer is supposed to review and approve all expenditures over $500. Donald Hayes also stood. I'm resigning from this board effective immediately. I want no part of whatever this is. So am I, Roger added. This is not what I signed up for. Brenda looked desperate. You can't resign in the middle of a meeting. Actually, they can, said a new voice from the back of the room. David Friedman, my lawyer, had arrived. He made his way through the crowd to the front. And I would suggest that the remaining board members consider doing the same before this situation gets worse. I'm representing Mr. Norris, and I can assure you that not only will we be defending against this baseless lawsuit, but we'll be filing a countersuit for abuse of process, harassment, and violation of his rights under Arizona state law. Furthermore, based on what I've just heard, there appear to be grounds for a separate lawsuit regarding the misappropriation of HOA funds. Karen Sullivan looked like she might cry. Linda Shaw was staring at the floor. Brenda, however, was defiant. This meeting is adjourned. Everyone needs to leave. No, Marcus Chen said. According to the bylaws, any homeowner can call for a special vote to remove board members for cause. I'm calling for that vote right now. Patricia nodded. I second that motion. Under Article 7, Section 3 of our bylaws, if 20% of homeowners presented a meeting call for a removal vote, it must be held immediately. We quickly did a count. Over 150 homeowners were present out of 237 homes. We needed 30 votes to call for the removal. Within seconds, hands shot up all around the room. We counted well over 70. Brenda tried to shut it down. This is not proper procedure. You need to file written notice. David Friedman smiled. Actually, Mrs. Carmichael, that section of the bylaws was amended 2 years ago to allow for emergency removal votes when circumstances warrant. This certainly qualifies. What followed was the fastest HOA vote I had ever witnessed. Patricia took charge, calling for a vote on the removal of Brenda Carmichael, Linda Shaw, and Karen Sullivan from the board. The vote was nearly unanimous, with only a handful of abstentions and 3 no votes, presumably from friends of the outgoing board members. Brenda tried to argue, tried to claim the vote was invalid, but David shut her down by reading directly from the bylaws. Within 30 minutes, all three women had been removed from their positions. The room erupted in applause. But we were not done yet. We needed a new board immediately. Patricia Owens was nominated and elected as president. Marcus Chen became vice president. Roger Patterson agreed to stay on as treasurer. A woman named Jennifer Abbott, who worked as a paralegal, was elected secretary. And a retired teacher named Frank Morrison took the final at-large position. The new board's first action was to vote unanimously to drop the lawsuit against me and to rescind the special assessment. Their second action was to authorize an independent audit of all HOA finances for the past 2 years, with a focus on the payments to Carmichael Consulting Services. As people filed out of the community center that night, the mood was jubilant. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were exchanging phone numbers and making plans to stay more involved in HOA affairs. I shook hands with dozens of people, many of whom apologized for initially being angry at me over the special assessment. The drama, however, was far from over. 2 weeks later, the independent audit was completed, and the findings were damning. Carmichael Consulting Services had received $83,000 in the past year, but there was virtually no documentation of what services had been provided. The invoices were vague, listing items like community oversight and strategic planning with no detail. Even worse, the audit revealed that Brenda had authorized several expenditures from the HOA reserve fund without board approval, including a $30,000 emergency repair to the community center that had never actually been done. The auditor found no evidence that any work had been performed, no contracts with vendors, and no permits filed with the city. Patricia called an emergency homeowners meeting to present the audit findings. The turnout was nearly as large as the previous meeting. When she read through the report, the anger in the room was palpable. "This is theft!" someone shouted. "We need to call the police." David Friedman, who had been retained by the new board to advise on legal matters, stepped forward. "I've already been in contact with the Phoenix Police Department's white-collar crime unit. Based on the audit findings, they've agreed to open an investigation. However, I want to be clear about what that means. This will be a criminal investigation, and if charges are filed, it will be the state prosecuting, not the HOA." "What about getting our money back?" Rachel asked. "The HOA can and should file a civil lawsuit against Brenda Carmichael, Linda Shaw, and Karen Sullivan to recover the misappropriated funds. We have strong evidence of breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and possibly theft. I'm prepared to take on that case if the board authorizes it." The new board voted immediately to authorize the lawsuit. Over the following weeks, I watched as my quiet neighborhood became the center of a full-scale legal battle. The police investigation moved forward quickly, with detectives interviewing current and former board members, reviewing financial records, and even searching Brenda's home. I was interviewed twice, once about the solar panel lawsuit and once about my observations of the board's conduct. I told them everything I knew, which honestly was not much until the special assessment letter had arrived. The detectives were professional and thorough, and they made it clear that they took HOA fraud cases seriously. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuit was filed. David Friedman and the new board went after all 3 former board members, but Brenda was the primary target. The complaint alleged that she had orchestrated a scheme to funnel HOA money to her personal consulting company for non-existent services, that she had approved fake invoices for work that was never performed, and that she had abused her position to enrich herself at the expense of the community. Linda Shaw and Karen Sullivan quickly lawyered up, and their attorneys reached out to David about potential settlements. It became clear that they had been complicit, but perhaps not the masterminds. Linda claimed that Brenda had told her the consulting fees were legitimate and that she had simply trusted her friend. Karen made similar claims. David was willing to negotiate with them, but insisted on full cooperation with both the civil case and the criminal investigation. Both women eventually agreed to settlements that required them to testify against Brenda and to pay restitution to the HOA. The amounts were not huge, $20,000 each, but it was something. Brenda, on the other hand, was fighting tooth and nail. Her lawyer filed motion after motion trying to get the case dismissed, arguing that the board had the authority to hire consultants and that any dispute about the value of services provided was a matter of opinion, not fraud. But the evidence was overwhelming. The auditor had documented everything meticulously. There were emails between Brenda and the management company where she had explicitly instructed them to process invoices from her company without board review. There were records showing that she had backdated some of the payments to make it appear they had been approved before she joined the board. The criminal case developed in parallel. 6 months after the initial complaint, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office filed formal charges against Brenda Carmichael. She was charged with theft, fraud, and misuse of HOA funds, all felonies under Arizona law. The charges carried potential prison time. I will never forget the day I saw her mugshot posted in the neighborhood Facebook group. This woman who had acted so imperious, so certain of her authority, now looked small and defeated in her booking photo. Some people in the neighborhood felt sympathy for her. I was not one of them. She had tried to weaponize the HOA to attack me over a legal improvement to my own property, and in the process, she had attempted to steal $2,000 from every family in our community. The criminal trial took place nearly a year after that fateful board meeting. I attended several days of testimony, curious to see how it would play out. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. Linda Shaw and Karen Sullivan both testified, describing how Brenda had convinced them to go along with her schemes. The HOA's former management company representative testified that Brenda had been unusually controlling about financial matters and had often bypassed normal approval processes. The most damaging testimony came from the auditor, who walked the jury through each fraudulent transaction in painstaking detail. By the time he was done, there was no question that Brenda had systematically stolen from the HOA. Brenda's defense was weak. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had provided legitimate services and that the payments were reasonable. But when pressed to describe what those services were, Brenda gave vague, unconvincing answers. She claimed she had provided advice and oversight, but could not point to any specific deliverables or outcomes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Brenda was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $113,000, the total amount the audit had identified as misappropriated. She was also barred from ever serving on an HOA board again in Arizona. The civil case settled shortly after the criminal verdict. With Brenda now a convicted felon, there was no point in continuing to fight. She agreed to a judgment against her for the full amount, though collecting it would be difficult given that she had already spent much of the money. Throughout all of this, life in Sunnyside Estates had improved dramatically. The new board was transparent, communicative, and reasonable. They reduced the number of petty violations, focused on actual community improvements, and made sure that all financial decisions were made in the open with full homeowner input. My solar panels continued to generate electricity without incident. In fact, after seeing the savings on my electric bill, several other neighbors installed their own panels. The new board approved every application without hesitation. One evening, about 18 months after the whole ordeal began, Marcus Chen invited me over for a backyard barbecue. His daughter was heading off to college in the fall, the college fund intact, thanks to the special assessment being rescinded. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually glad all that happened," Marcus said, flipping burgers on his grill. "It woke everyone up. People actually care about the HOA now. We have homeowners attending meetings, asking questions, staying involved. It's what it should have been all along." I nodded, sipping my beer. I just wanted to save money on my electric bill. I didn't expect to start a revolution. Marcus laughed. "Sometimes the best revolutions are the ones nobody planned. You just happen to be the catalyst." Patricia Owens walked over, carrying a bowl of potato salad. Since becoming HOA president, she had transformed the organization. Monthly financial reports were now posted online for all homeowners to see. Board meetings were recorded and archived. A new policy required any expenditure over $1,000 to be approved by at least 4 of the 5 board members, with the 5th member having the right to demand a full homeowner vote if they had concerns. "Quincy, I wanted to thank you again," Patricia said. "If you hadn't pushed back against that special assessment, if you hadn't organized that first meeting, none of this would have happened. Brenda and her cronies would still be running things, and who knows how much more money they would have stolen." "I was just defending myself," I said. "You're the one who did the real work, getting the audit, organizing the votes, pushing for accountability. We all did our part, she replied. That's how communities are supposed to work, people coming together to solve problems. Over the next few hours, more neighbors arrived. The barbecue turned into an impromptu block party, with kids playing in the street and adults chatting in clusters across several yards. It felt different from before all the drama. People were more connected, more engaged. The shared experience of fighting back against corruption had created bonds that had not existed before. Jennifer Abbott, the new board secretary, mentioned that she had been tracking HOA reform efforts across Arizona. Apparently, our case had gotten some media attention, and other communities were starting to ask harder questions of their own boards. There's a state legislator who's talking about introducing new HOA oversight requirements based on what happened here, she said. Mandatory audits, stricter financial disclosure rules, easier processes for homeowners to remove board members who abuse their authority. The thought that our neighborhood's experience might lead to systemic change was both humbling and encouraging. HOAs were supposed to serve homeowners, not the other way around. For too long, too many boards had operated with little oversight, and some, like Brenda's, had taken advantage of that lack of accountability. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, I walked back to my house with Marcus. The solar panels on my roof were barely visible in the fading light, but I could see the status lights blinking on the inverter, indicating that the system was functioning perfectly. "You ever think about what would have happened if you had just taken the panels down?" Marcus asked. "If you had given in when they first threatened to sue?" I had thought about it, actually. If I had been less stubborn or more conflict-averse, I might have removed the panels just to avoid the hassle. Brenda would have won. She would have continued her schemes, and the neighborhood would have remained in the dark about the corruption. "I'm glad I didn't," I said. "Not just for me, but for everyone. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when it's uncomfortable." The legal bills from the whole ordeal had been substantial, but the new HOA board had voted to reimburse me for my attorney fees out of the restitution money that was slowly being recovered from Brenda. It would never fully compensate for the stress and time involved, but it was a meaningful gesture that showed the community stood behind me. My work as a software engineer had actually benefited from the experience in an unexpected way. I had started developing an app designed to help homeowners track their HOA's activities, providing templates for records requests, alerts about upcoming votes, and tools to organize community responses to board actions. Several neighbors were beta testing it, and there was talk of making it available more broadly. The app would not prevent every instance of HOA corruption, but it could make it harder for board members to operate in the shadows. Transparency was the best disinfectant, and technology could help provide that transparency. 6 months later, I was in my home office when my phone rang. It was David Friedman, my lawyer. We had stayed in touch even though the case was essentially over. "Quincy, I wanted to give you an update. Brenda Carmichael's appeals have been exhausted. The conviction is final, and she's currently serving her sentence at the state prison in Goodyear." "How much time does she have left?" "About 18 months, assuming good behavior. But here's the interesting part. The restitution payments are actually coming in. Between the settlement with Linda and Karen, the seizure of some of Brenda's assets, and a payment plan her family has agreed to, the HOA has recovered about 70% of what was stolen. That was better than I had expected. Many fraud victims never saw their money back. That's good news for the community." "It is, and Patricia tells me the HOA is in the best financial shape it's been in years. The reserve fund is fully funded, all legitimate maintenance has been completed, and there's even a surplus." After we hung up, I sat back in my chair and reflected on everything that had happened. It had been almost 2 years since I opened that mailbox and found the special assessment letter. 2 years of stress, anger, meetings, legal proceedings, and uncertainty. But also 2 years of community building, of people coming together, of holding power accountable. The next HOA meeting was that evening, and I decided to attend. I'd been going regularly since the new board took over, part of my commitment to staying involved and making sure history did not repeat itself. The meeting was held in the community center, the same room where we had overthrown the old board. About 40 people were in attendance, a healthy number for a routine meeting. Patricia ran through the agenda efficiently. approval of the previous meeting's minutes, a financial report from Roger, updates on ongoing maintenance projects, and a discussion about potential upgrades to the playground equipment. It was all remarkably boring in the best possible way. This was what an HOA was supposed to be, a practical organization handling the mundane details of community management, not a fiefdom for power-hungry individuals to exploit. During the open comment period, a new resident named Thomas stood up. He had moved into the neighborhood just a few months ago. Ha! I have to say, when I was buying my house, the realtor told me about what happened here with the previous board. I almost backed out because I figured any HOA with that kind of drama would be a nightmare. But after living here for a few months, I'm really impressed. This is one of the most well-run communities I've seen. Thank you to the board and to all the homeowners who stay engaged. There was a round of applause. Patricia smiled. Thank you, Thomas. I think we all learned a valuable lesson about the importance of paying attention and holding our leaders accountable. This board works for you, not the other way around. After the meeting, I chatted with several neighbors about various topics, from local schools to recommendations for landscapers. Rachel Montgomery mentioned that she was thinking about running for the board when one of the current members' terms expired next year. You should, I encouraged her. The more good people willing to serve, the better. That's how we keep things running smoothly. As I walked home that night, I passed house after house with lights glowing in windows, families inside living their lives. This was what a neighborhood should feel like: safe, stable, and governed by people who actually cared about the community rather than their own interests. My solar panels had been the spark, but the real story was about ordinary people standing up to corruption and taking back control of their own community. It was not glamorous or dramatic in the way that makes for exciting television, but it was real and meaningful in ways that would last for years to come. The following spring, I was invited to speak at a community organizing workshop hosted by a local nonprofit that worked on HOA reform issues. They wanted me to share the story of what had happened in Sunnyside Estates as a case study in effective homeowner activism. I was nervous about public speaking, but I agreed. About 50 people attended, representing different HOA communities across the Phoenix metro area. Many of them were dealing with their own problem boards, though, thankfully, most situations had not escalated to the level of criminal activity we had experienced. I walked them through the timeline, from the special assessment letter to the board removal vote to the criminal trial. I emphasized several key points: the importance of documenting everything, the power of community organization, the necessity of understanding your HOA's bylaws and state law, and the value of having experienced people like Patricia and David who knew how to navigate the system. During the question and answer session, a woman in her 60s raised her hand. What would you say to someone who's afraid to challenge their board because they worry about retaliation? It was a good question, and one I had grappled with myself. Fear of retaliation is real and valid, I said, but the best defense against retaliation is transparency and numbers. When you challenge a board publicly, with other homeowners standing beside you, it's much harder for them to retaliate without facing consequences. And document everything. If they try to retaliate, you'll have evidence. Another person asked about the costs involved. We can't all afford lawyers like you did. What options do regular people have? Start with your state's Department of Real Estate or whatever agency oversees HOAs in your area, I replied. Many times, just filing a complaint will get the board to back down because they don't want regulatory scrutiny. Also, look for lawyers who specialize in HOA law. Many of them will do initial consultations for free and may take cases on contingency if the board's conduct is egregious enough. And sometimes, just knowing your rights and citing the relevant laws can be enough to make a board think twice. After the workshop, several people came up to thank me and share their own stories. The common thread was a sense of powerlessness in the face of overbearing boards. I wished I could help all of them, but the best I could do was offer encouragement and resources. Back in Sunnyside Estates, life continued to improve. The playground equipment was upgraded, the community center got a fresh coat of paint, and several common areas were re-landscaped with drought-resistant plants that saved water and maintenance costs. Every decision was made transparently, with homeowner input. The solar panel trend continued to spread. By the end of that year, over 30 homes in the neighborhood had installed panels. We were becoming known as one of the most energy-efficient communities in the area, and property values were actually rising faster than comparable neighborhoods. Brenda Carmichael was released from prison after serving 2 years, about 6 months less than her original sentence due to good behavior credits. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved out of state, to Nevada, to live with relatives. She would be on probation for several more years and had a felony record that would follow her forever. I did not take any pleasure in her downfall, but I did believe justice had been served. She had made deliberate choices to steal from people who trusted her, and she had faced the consequences. The fact that the legal system had worked, that the community had come together to demand accountability, and that reforms had been implemented to prevent future abuse felt like the right outcome. 3 years after the initial special assessment letter, I was elected to the HOA board myself. Roger Patterson had decided to step down, and several people had approached me about running for treasurer. I was hesitant at first, remembering all the drama, but Patricia convinced me. "We need people who've been through the fire," she said. "People who understand what can go wrong and are committed to making sure it doesn't happen again." So I ran, and I won easily. My first act as treasurer was to implement an even more robust financial tracking system with quarterly reports that broke down every expense in detail. I also established a policy that required competitive bids for any work over $5,000 and created a rotating committee of non-board member homeowners to review all contracts. Serving on the board gave me a new perspective on how much work went into running a community. It was not glamorous. It was often tedious, and it required careful attention to detail. But it was also rewarding to know that we were managing resources responsibly and making decisions that genuinely improved people's lives. One evening, during a board meeting in my second year as treasurer, we were reviewing proposals for repaving some of the neighborhood streets. It was a big project, close to $400,000, and we were evaluating 3 different contractors. As we discussed the merits of each proposal, I realized how different this process was from what had happened under Brenda's board. Every number was scrutinized, every contractor was vetted, every decision was documented. There was no room for favoritism or corruption because multiple sets of eyes were watching. This was what good governance looked like. It was not exciting, but it was essential. The street project was approved by the homeowners in a special vote with over 70% in favor. The work was completed on time and under budget, and the contractor we selected did an excellent job. It was a far cry from the fake $30,000 community center repair that had never happened under Brenda's watch. As my time on the board continued, I stayed in touch with David Friedman, who had become something of an informal advisor on HOA issues across the state. He told me that the legislation inspired by our case had passed, requiring annual audits for all HOAs in Arizona with more than 100 units, stricter disclosure requirements for board members about potential conflicts of interest, and an easier process for homeowners to petition for special elections to remove board members. "You guys really did change things," David said during one of our conversations. "Other communities are better protected now because of what happened in Sunnyside Estates." It was gratifying to hear, though I knew that laws alone would not prevent all abuse. Eternal vigilance was still required. HOAs would always need engaged homeowners willing to pay attention and speak up when something was wrong. 5 years after that fateful special assessment letter, Patricia Owens decided to step down as HOA president. She had served admirably, but she wanted to travel with her husband and enjoy retirement without the responsibilities of board service. The neighborhood threw her a huge appreciation party in the community center. Over 100 people attended, sharing stories and presenting her with gifts. I gave a speech thanking her for her leadership and her courage in standing up to corruption. "Patricia did more than just fix our HOA," I said. "She showed us what real leadership looks like. She taught us that transparency and accountability are not optional, they are essential. And she proved that when good people come together, they can overcome even the most entrenched abuse of power." The new president was Marcus Chen, my friend from across the street. He had been serving as vice president and was ready to step into the top role. I had no doubt he would do an excellent job. As the party wound down, Patricia pulled me aside. Quincy, I want you to know that you were the catalyst for all of this. If you had just paid that special assessment, if you had not fought back, none of the good things that came after would have happened. You should be proud. I was just protecting my own interests, I said, slightly embarrassed by the praise. Maybe at first, she replied, but you inspired a community to stand up for themselves. That's no small thing. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized she was right. The solar panels had been about saving money on my electric bills and doing my small part for the environment. I never imagined they would lead to uncovering a fraud scheme, overthrowing a corrupt board, and helping to reform HOA laws across the state. But that was the thing about standing up for what was right. You never knew where it might lead. Small acts of resistance could snowball into larger movements. One person refusing to back down could inspire dozens, then hundreds, to do the same. My house, with its solar panels gleaming on the roof, stood as a reminder of that truth. Every time I looked at them, I remembered that day I opened the mailbox and found the special assessment letter. I remembered the anger and fear I had felt. But I also remembered the decision I made to fight back, to not let an unjust authority go unchallenged. That decision had changed everything, not just for me, but for an entire community. And in a small way, it had contributed to making HOAs across Arizona more accountable and less prone to the kind of abuse that Brenda Carmichael had perpetrated. The solar panels continued to generate electricity, day after day, year after year. They had paid for themselves within 5 years, just as the installer had promised, and they would continue producing power for decades to come. But their real value was not measured in kilowatt hours or dollars saved. It was measured in the community that had rallied to defend them, and in the reforms that had followed. On a warm Arizona evening, 7 years after the whole ordeal began, I sat on my front porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Children played in the street, neighbors chatted in their yards, and everything felt peaceful and normal. Marcus walked over from across the street carrying 2 beers. "Thought you might want one of these instead of tea," he said with a grin. I took the beer gratefully. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the neighborhood wind down for the evening. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said. "New people moving in have no idea about any of the drama that happened. To them, this is just a nice, well-run neighborhood with reasonable HOA fees and good amenities." "That's how it should be," I replied. "The best legacy we can leave is a system that works so well that people take it for granted." "True," Marcus agreed. "But those of us who were here, who lived through it, will always remember. And we'll make sure the next generation of homeowners understands why staying engaged matters." We clinked our beer bottles together in a quiet toast. To justice, to community, to the principle that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win. The solar panels on my roof caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing briefly before the evening shadows took over. It had been a long journey from that initial special assessment letter to this moment of peace and stability. There had been anger, fear, conflict, and uncertainty, but there had also been courage, solidarity, and triumph. A community had come together, held its leaders accountable, and built something better in the aftermath. And it all started because I refused to let an unjust HOA board take away my right to generate clean energy from the Arizona sun. Sometimes the smallest acts of defiance lead to the greatest changes. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. And sometimes justice actually prevails. As darkness settled over Sunnyside Estates, lights began to flicker on in houses up and down the street. My solar panels had already switched over to battery storage mode, ready to provide backup power if needed. Everything was working exactly as it should. The HOA that had once tried to sue me for installing those panels was now encouraging other homeowners to do the same. The board that had levied an illegal special assessment to fund a baseless lawsuit was now serving time in prison or had been forced to pay restitution. And the community that had been divided and disengaged was now united and vigilant. It was not a perfect ending, because real life never offered those. There were still occasional disagreements at board meetings, still debates about priorities and spending. But the foundation was solid now, built on transparency, accountability, and a shared understanding that the HOA existed to serve the homeowners, not to rule over them. As I finished my beer and prepared to head inside for the evening, I took one last look at my house, at the solar panels that had inadvertently become a symbol of resistance and reform. They were just pieces of silicon and metal engineered to convert sunlight into electricity. But they represented something more, the idea that individuals had rights that no organization could arbitrarily take away, and that communities were strongest when they stood together against abuse of power. Brenda Carmichael had tried to use the HOA as a weapon to attack me, and in doing so, she had awakened a sleeping giant. The homeowners of Sunnyside Estates had discovered their collective power, and once discovered, that power could not be put back to sleep. 7 years later, the neighborhood was thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of the conflict. Property values were up, community engagement was high, and the HOA was running smoothly with no hint of corruption. New families moved in regularly, attracted by the area's reputation for being well-managed and homeowner-friendly. My solar panels kept generating power, my electric bills stayed low, and life went on. But I never forgot the lessons learned during those tumultuous months. Stay engaged, ask questions, demand transparency, and never be afraid to stand up when something is wrong. Those principles applied not just to HOAs, but to every aspect of civic life. The story of how an HOA levied a special assessment to sue me, only to have the homeowners find out and fire the board, had become part of the neighborhood's folklore. New residents heard about it from their neighbors, usually accompanied by assurances that things were much better now. It served as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a reminder of what could go wrong when power went unchecked, and what could go right when people came together to demand better. As I settled into my evening routine, I felt grateful for how things had turned out. It could have gone differently. If I'd been less stubborn, if Patricia had been less diligent, if the community had been less willing to get involved, Brenda might have gotten away with it all. The lawsuit would have been dropped eventually, but the corruption would have continued, and more money would have been stolen. Instead, justice had been served, reforms had been implemented, and a community had been strengthened. It was a better outcome than I could have hoped for when I first opened that special assessment letter and felt my stomach drop. The next morning, I woke to another beautiful Arizona day, with the sun already streaming through my bedroom window. The solar panels were hard at work, converting that abundant sunshine into electricity. And somewhere in the state prison in Goodyear, Brenda Carmichael was presumably waking up too, facing another day of consequences for her actions. I did not wish her ill, but I did not feel sorry for her either. She had made her choices, and the community had responded appropriately. That was how systems were supposed to work. When people did wrong, they faced accountability. When organizations abused their power, they were reformed or replaced. As I made my coffee and prepared for another day of work, I glanced at the framed photo on my wall. It was from Patricia's retirement party, showing dozens of neighbors gathered in the community center, smiling and celebrating. In the corner of the photo, you could just see a banner someone had made: transparency, accountability, community. Those 3 words summed up everything we had fought for and everything we had achieved. They were not flashy or dramatic, but they were the foundation of good governance at any level. Whether it was an HOA, a city council, or a national government, those principles were essential. My phone buzzed with a reminder about the upcoming board meeting. Even though I had served my term and rotated off the board 2 years ago, I still attended regularly. Old habits died hard, and I genuinely believed that ongoing vigilance was necessary to maintain the reforms we had fought so hard to implement. The meeting agenda looked routine: approval of minutes, financial report, discussion of landscaping maintenance contracts, update on pool repairs, normal, boring HOA business, exactly as it should be. I smiled to myself, remembering how dramatically different these meetings used to be, back when Brenda and her allies controlled the board. The secrecy, the hostility toward homeowner questions, the rubber stamping of questionable expenditures. All of that was gone now, replaced by a culture of openness and cooperation. It had taken years of work to build that culture, and it would take continued effort to maintain it. But it was worth it. Every month without drama, every transparent financial report, every routine decision made properly was a small victory, a reminder that the system was working as intended. As I headed out to run some errands, I waved to several neighbors who were out walking dogs or tending to their yards. The sense of community that had been forged during our fight against the corrupt board persisted years later. People knew each other, looked out for each other, and stayed involved in neighborhood affairs. That afternoon, I met David Friedman for lunch at a restaurant in Scottsdale. We had stayed in touch over the years, and he occasionally consulted with me when he had new HOA cases that involved similar issues. "I've got a new client situation that reminds me of yours," he said over sandwiches. "Board president in Tempe has been funneling contracts to her brother's construction company. Homeowners are starting to ask questions. What are you advising them to do?" "Same playbook that worked for you guys. Document everything, request financial records, organize the community, and be prepared to call for a special election if the board does not cooperate. I also told them to file a complaint with the Department of Real Estate right away." "The Sunnyside Estates model," I said with a slight smile. "It works," David replied. "Since your case and the law changes that followed, I have seen a real shift in how HOAs operate. Most boards are much more careful now because they know homeowners are watching and know they have recourse." We talked about other cases he had handled, other communities that had faced similar challenges. The patterns were depressingly familiar. Board members who saw their positions as opportunities for personal benefit rather than service, homeowners who did not pay attention until it was almost too late, and the difficult process of rooting out corruption and rebuilding trust. But there were also success stories, communities that had reformed themselves and become models of good governance. Sunnyside Estates was one of them, and I was proud of that. As we finished lunch and prepared to part ways, David said something that stuck with me. "You know, Quincy, most people never stand up to authority even when they know it is wrong. They're afraid of the consequences, or they don't think they can make a difference. You did both. You stood up and you made a difference. That is rare." I drove home thinking about his words. I had never seen myself as particularly brave or exceptional. I was just a guy who wanted to keep his solar panels and did not want to pay an unjust fine. But maybe that was the point. Ordinary people doing ordinary things, refusing to accept injustice, could create extraordinary change. That evening, the neighborhood held its annual summer barbecue at the community park. It had become a tradition over the years, a chance for everyone to get together in an informal setting. I brought a potato salad and spent a few hours chatting with neighbors, eating too much food and watching kids play on the upgraded playground equipment. Marcus, still serving as HOA president, got up to make a brief speech thanking everyone for their continued engagement and support. He mentioned some of the projects completed over the past year and previewed some plans for the year ahead. It was all very straightforward and unremarkable, which was exactly the point. As the sun set and people started packing up to head home, I found myself standing with Patricia, Marcus, and a few other neighbors who had been central to the fight against the corrupt board years ago. "Remember when we thought dealing with Brenda and her crew was the worst thing that could happen to this neighborhood?" Rachel said with a laugh. "Now our biggest problem is deciding what color to paint the community center trim." "I will take boring problems over corruption any day," Patricia replied. Everyone nodded in agreement. We stood there for a moment, watching families gather their things and say their goodbyes, children running around with glow sticks as darkness fell. This was what we had fought for, a normal, functional community where people could live their lives without drama or corruption. My solar panels, the catalyst for everything that had happened, continued their quiet work, invisible in the darkness, but ready to harness the sun's energy again when morning came. They were a constant reminder that sometimes the simplest decisions, the most basic assertions of rights, could lead to transformations no one anticipated. As I walked home that night, pleasantly tired from the evening's festivities, I reflected on how far we had come. 7 years from crisis to stability, from corruption to transparency, from division to unity. It had not been easy, and there had been moments when the outcome was uncertain, but we had persevered. And we had won. Not just a legal victory, though that mattered. Not just financial restitution, though that helped. We had won something more fundamental. We had reclaimed our community from those who would abuse it, and we had built something better in its place. The lights were on in my house as I approached, powered in part by the solar panels that had started it all. I smiled, unlocked my door, and stepped inside. Tomorrow would bring another day, another opportunity to stay engaged and vigilant. But tonight, I could rest easy, knowing that Sunnyside Estates was in good hands and that the hard-won reforms would endure as long as people remained committed to transparency and accountability. The HOA had tried to levy a special assessment to sue me. The homeowners had found out and fired the board. Justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and a community had emerged stronger and more united than before. It was a story worth remembering and a model worth following for anyone facing similar challenges. And it all started with solar panels and a refusal to back down in the face of unjust authority. Sometimes that is all it takes to change everything.